Hey there. Tonight we're returning not to grand castles or royal courts, but to the forgotten edges of the past. Those corners of history that never made it into paintings. We're speaking of medieval peasants. They weren't nobles or knights. They endured famine, illness, bitter winters, and countless minor humiliations. All without titles or praise. No glory followed them. No legacy endured. Only endless toil, brief rest, and a quiet kind of endurance. Most wouldn't manage a single day in such a life. If slow, gentle history like this helps ease their mind, they might consider liking the video or subscribing, but only if it genuinely offers peace. We'd love to know too, where they're listening from and what time it is for them. There's something strangely soothing about realizing others are also drifting to sleep with the same hushed tale. So go ahead, dim the lights, let a fan hum softly in the background if that helps. Settle in and let's begin at the margins of the map. This village carries no name. Or if it did, no one recalls it now. It rests quietly in a shallow valley, somewhere in the vague middle of nowhere. A soft fold in the land, just remote enough to escape roads, records, or royal notice. They wouldn't locate it on a map, even if they owned one, though they never have. Maps are stories for others. Here, the world halts where the tree line starts. The forest is dense and deliberate, like something ancient that only barely permits their presence. The fields stretch in uneven swaths of green and brown, worked to exhaustion, then worked again. Somewhere far to the north there's said to be a river. They've never seen it, but it's mentioned with the kind of reverence one might use for dragons or saints. This is where they were born, and where they'll pass. Perhaps only 60 steps separating birth from death. The homes appear hunched, as though the wind has leaned on them through too many winters. The walls are made of waiel and dorb, that is mud, straw and sticks, woven by hand and patched again and again with whatever the season hasn't stolen. The thatched roofs droop under their own weight, always leaking just out of reach. The air carries the smell of smoke, damp wool and soil, tinged with livestock and mildew. None of it surprises them anymore. It's simply the scent of life here. The road, if it can be called that, is merely a strip of mud worn into twin ruts by ox carts, deep enough now to hold rainwater and mosquitoes. No one important has ever come this way. Maybe no one ever will. Most days unfold in quiet. A faraway bell sometimes marks the hours, carried by wind from another village's chapel. Though often they just measure time by the angle of sunlight, the creeping of shadows across the field, or the familiar ache that settles in their back before noon. A dozen families, give or take, call this place home. Just enough to gather around when feast days come. On most days, everyone is familiar with one another, and equally familiar with each other's troubles. Yet those troubles are politely overlooked, until the moment they can no longer be. The village elder, if that's even the right word for him, is a man called Tom. He once had a brief exchange with a wandering monk, and now recalls it often, presenting it as proof of his wisdom. No one challenges him. After all, Tom's hut is still standing, and his goat appears to be in good shape, which in this place seems enough to qualify as leadership. Nothing is exact here. No papers exist. No property lines are drawn. There are no ledgers, no official maps. Instead, land is measured by memory, just beyond the old elm tree, or near the spot where the soil starts to soften. If arguments arise, they're usually settled with a few raised voices, a shrug, and occasionally a shared loaf of bread passed between hands until the tension fades. No school, no tavern, no inn can be found in this small village. If a stranger were ever to appear, their presence would be the topic of conversation for weeks. Where did they wander in from? What might they want? Are they cursed somehow? Do they smell of the sea? The arrival of an outsider stirs both excitement and a vague, creeping fear. But departures are rare. In truth, no one really leaves. The notion of travel exists more as a story than a goal. They've heard whispers of towns and cities, of buildings that climb 2 or even 3 stories high. But such ideas are as fanciful as tales of talking wolves or women who become birds. It's impossible to long for a world one has never glimpsed. The forest is thick, the hills stretch endlessly, and as for roads, if they do exist, they're spoken of more for the dangers they carry robbers, bad omens, than for any promise of safe arrival. Even if they reached one of those distant places, what then? They wouldn't speak the tongue. They'd carry no coin. Customs would confuse them. They might not even know how many winters they've lived. So they remain. There's a kind of safety in what's known, even if it's uncomfortable or dull, or marked by a leaky roof and a well that barely fills. The stew has been simmering for 3 days, and yet there's reassurance in routine, in knowing where the kindling is stacked, in who can help mend a broken fence, in which sliver of sky signals it's time to gather the sheep. They rise with first light and rest once the dark settles in. Between those hours they labour. It may not be much, but it is life. And within its steady rhythm they find a quiet kind of contentment, one that doesn't question, doesn't require explanation, and asks for nothing beyond the view from the highest hilltop nearby. Now and then a tale might drift through, of a distant war, a fallen king, or a blazing star that frightened villagers 5 days' journey away. Yet such news rarely reaches them whole. It becomes a tale softened by too many retellings, thinned between a merchant's exaggeration and a shepherd's cousin's version. Even time moves differently here. Seasons do not transition cleanly. They slip one into another. A soggy spring becomes a drenched summer, and a biting frost leads into a winter that eats through their boots. They don't track years. They count harvests, dry ones, wet ones. There was the bad year when the rye turned black with rot. Then there was the good year, the one where the barley came in full and thick, and even old Margery found a reason to smile for a full week. The steward, well, he had a job to do. He gathered grain, asked his questions, scribbled into his ledger. They answered carefully, never offering too many details. He didn't seem fond of too much explanation. They'd never seen the king. Weren't quite certain what it was he did. But they knew his name, and they spoke it aloud when they prayed, just in case that small gesture carried weight. Out here, on the distant edge of the known world, very little shifted, and when something did, it rarely meant anything good. Still the hearth glowed. The roof more or less stayed in place, the cottage stayed warm, and tomorrow the same sun would rise over the same hills. For now that felt like enough. Over the course of a life, they might walk hundreds of miles, but nearly all of it would be in circles. In the medieval countryside, most souls never journeyed more than a few miles from the place of their birth. Not because they lacked imagination, or will, or even shoes, though boots were often a scarce comfort, but because anything beyond the next ridge didn't seem to belong to them. The thought of setting out to find it felt as unlikely as growing wings. They grew up knowing the names of each patch of earth between their door and the furthest boundary of the fields. They could spot every twisted tree root along the trail to the well. By the depth of the footprints pressed into the mud, they could guess who had passed earlier that day. Beyond that, the world felt hypothetical. The neighbouring village might be just 5 miles away. And yet it seemed as far as another continent. Stories would drift in. Who wed whom? Who stole a goat? Who whispered that the priest snored during sermons? But these were just tales unconfirmed and distant. They hadn't visited, and likely never would. Because travel wasn't thrilling. It wasn't adventure. It was a slow, tiring, often perilous endeavour. Paths weren't tidy walkways edged with signs and inns. They were muddy stretches threading through woods, across fields, and into vast silences. There were no maps, no clear guides, only the kind of directions that went, walk until you find the leaning pine, then turn near the rock shaped like a sleeping pig. And on those winding tracks, threats waited. First, the forest itself. Medieval woods weren't gentle. They were deep, shadowed, tangled with roots and sounds that defied explanation. Boars, wolves, and sometimes men who did not wish to be seen. If they hadn't been born among trees, the forest didn't want them there. Second, the bandits. People who'd lost everything, people without land or hope. Travellers were exposed, especially those who looked even slightly nourished. A man walking with purpose might be mistaken for someone carrying coin. A woman alone, well, that could mean she had something worth taking. They learned fast, boldness wasn't protection. Third, getting Getting lost wasn't a small mishap. If they strayed too far from the path, there wouldn't be anyone sent out to look. Following a river downstream wouldn't bring salvation. They might go days without spotting another living soul. A person could vanish into the undergrowth like smoke, unnoticed. Their absence might only be realised on the next feast day, when someone asked about them and another simply gave a shrug. Then came the practical worries. If they travelled too far, who would care for the field? Who would feed the animals? What if the steward appeared to collect taxes while they were away? Try explaining an empty cottage to a man holding a ledger. Their duties didn't wait just because they felt curious about the world beyond the hills. And even if, somehow, they managed to reach a different village, then what? No one would be expecting them. They wouldn't be welcomed. Outsiders were often linked with misfortune, illness, theft, strange behaviours. They might speak in slightly unfamiliar tones, use words that didn't quite fit, or even hold a spoon differently. Suspicion came easily. Or worse, hospitality wasn't promised, food was limited, and beds were already full. The safest place was still home. Not because it lacked danger, but because it was known. They understood which part of the roof gave in during rain, which hens had a habit of wandering too far, which neighbour might loan a tool without asking for something in return. Out there, no one owed them a favour. Still, some people did travel. Not often the peasants, but others, merchants, monks, messengers. People who moved with purpose or under protection. Perhaps once or twice a year, they'd pass through, leading carts stacked with wool or barrels of salted fish, their conversations trailing behind them like campfire smoke. They spoke of stone cities and busy markets, of spice cellars and cobbled streets that didn't dissolve into sludge when it rained. It all sounded like a tale meant for dreaming. They listened, but they didn't let themselves imagine it too vividly. Because even if it were all true, what then? They couldn't read. They didn't carry coin. They wouldn't know what gestures were considered polite. A city could swallow them whole, and no one would bother to learn their name. So they stayed. Not always out of fear, though fear did visit, but because there were tasks to complete. A broken fence to fix, a niece to watch over, some barley to dry, a dozen small things, each waiting before the sun dropped beneath the tree line. And truthfully, they didn't need a world larger than the one they had. The village provided enough. It held quarrels and chatter, weather and illness, brief happiness, and quiet triumphs. It followed the rhythm of bells, the shifting seasons, and the small, steady satisfaction of simply making it to another morning. Sometimes dreams would drift in, a thought of whatever lay beyond the trees. But most days they simply hoped the stew wouldn't burn while fetching the water. The village was enough. There was gossip. There was weather. There were quarrels, fevers, and fleeting little joys. The village followed the rhythm of bells and the slow, predictable cycle of the seasons. And in surviving one more day, they found a quiet kind of pride. Sometimes dreams would drift in, about what might exist beyond the tree line. But most days, they only wished the stew wouldn't burn while fetching water. Some people did leave, not many, usually those with nothing left to lose, or those too bold for the village to hold. Occasionally someone young and restless would set off in search of a purpose, or a wage, or a war. Perhaps they'd return, bearing a limp or a tale, or perhaps not. And when they didn't, few words were offered, only a gentle shake of the head, and the phrase, "He went beyond the trees," as though that alone explained it. For those who stayed behind, life was small, but familiar. Not lonely, exactly. Their days were filled with neighbours, animals, kin, and the land itself. Repetition brought its own kind of comfort. They didn't need to wander far to know the sweetness of warm bread or the kindness of company. No distant city was required to feel hope, grief, or love. As the years passed and the bones began to stiffen, as the children grew taller than the fence posts, the idea of leaving faded. Not out of sadness, but with quiet clarity. Some people were made to travel, they were not. There was no master plan, no detailed drawing, no bundles of numbered beams waiting for assembly, just mud, just timber, and whatever else the earth hadn't already claimed. Their home wasn't a house in the sense most might imagine, it was a compromise. Between shelter and storm, between effort and erosion, between what they needed and what the soil begrudgingly allowed. It began with a frame, timber hewn from the closest grove. Tools used had passed through more generations than they could name. The wood bent, it twisted, but that was fine. So did their walls. Once the skeleton stood, they wove narrow branches or supple sticks between the posts, a technique known as WL. It wasn't beautiful nor swift, but it mostly held, much like their life. Next came the daub, a blend of earth, straw, dung, and water. They pressed it into the gaps, smoothing just enough to hold back the wind and pretend it was intentional. It dried with time, cracked in sunlight, flaked in chunks, always in need of patching before winter arrived. Eventually they stopped noticing the smell. The roof was thatch, straw layered and tied tightly to beams. When new, it glowed gold, almost lovely. But rain came. Birds followed. And time. Its edges frayed. Colours dulled. Leaks appeared in places they hadn't expected. They placed buckets in corners they once hoped wouldn't need them. No shingles, no sealants. Just more patching, until the entire thing seemed more repair than roof. Some days they wondered if a cart might serve better as shelter. The floor was earth. They told themselves it was firm, and in a way it was. Years of sweeping, walking, spilling had packed it tight. But it softened with rain, it cracked with frost. And when the goats wandered in at night, it became anyone's guess what truly lay beneath their hooves. Beneath their feet they might scatter straw or rushes to soften the dirt floor. It helped. A little. But soon the straw turned damp, picked up grime, and wore down to dust underfoot. Then they'd sweep it out and start again. Or not. Eventually the straw simply became part of the ground, blending in like it had always belonged there. Windows were just gaps in the wall, covered with wooden shutters that swung awkwardly and never fully sealed. Glass was far too costly, too rare, too fragile. So the wind came in. The chill crept in. The sounds of livestock drifted inside. Sometimes even the livestock themselves wandered in. A single door, usually crooked from frost shifting the frame, hung by old hinges. It latched with a hook or a wooden peg, not to keep thieves out, since there was little to steal, but to stop chickens from escaping and wind from howling through. Inside, the layout could best be called communal. One room, maybe two if a lean-to or loft had been added. But typically just a single shared space, where they cooked, slept, worked, talked, argued, and hoped. Everyone lived together, parents, children, a grandparent, maybe a cousin or a neighbour's child whose parents were gone or ill. In the centre stood a hearth, stone if they were fortunate, clay if not. Smoke drifted out through a hole in the roof, more or less. There was no chimney. The air was always slightly smoky, a bit damp, and tinged with the scent of stew that had been reheated far too many times. Furniture was minimal. A table, a bench, maybe a stool, perhaps a carved chest, if someone in the family had married well or inherited skill. Beds were wooden frames stuffed with straw or feathers, always shared, always squeaking. Blankets were wool, thick, coarse, never fully dry. Up in the rafters they stored garlic, onions, herbs, maybe even a small ham if the pig had been generous that year. One could tell the difference between early winter and late spring just by breathing the air above. Sometimes it comforted them. Sometimes it reminded them how close they were to running out. Animals were part of the household, literally. A cow might sleep in the corner. Chickens, a goat. It wasn't clean, but it was warm. They learned to ignore the clucks, the rustles, the occasional midnight bleat. These sounds became part of the background, like wind in the thatch, or the slow groan of shifting walls. Nothing was level. The floor dipped, the ceiling sloped. The walls bulged as if the whole house breathed with the seasons. They fixed what they could, ignored what they couldn't. Every spring they swore they'd fix the back wall. Every autumn it still leaned. It wasn't built to last. It was built to endure the next storm. And for all its flaws, and there were many, it was still home. They knew where the cold slipped in, and how to block it with an old sack. They knew which roof beam could hold. They knew which beam would hold the pot, and which one creaked if someone stood too close. They noticed how the sunlight filtered in through the slats each afternoon, and exactly where the dog liked to curl up when strangers walked by. What outsiders might label as poverty, they recognized as effort, as resourcefulness and adaptation. A roof that hadn't yet collapsed. That was a success. A fire still burning at first light. A quiet blessing. A dry patch in the corner, more precious than coin. And when they finally lay down at night, surrounded by snores and smoke and stillness and straw, what they felt wasn't pride exactly, but presence. This was their space. It leaned, it shifted, it dripped when the wind changed, but it stood, and so did they. For most medieval peasants, food wasn't an event. It wasn't colourful, nor varied, nor even reliably hot. It was a recurring problem, solved each day with the same handful of tools and the same weary hope that something nourishing might come of it. Their kitchen, if it could be called that, was merely a corner by the hearth. There was no pantry, no tidy shelves of ingredients, no herbs carefully drying in the sunlight. Only a pot, a fire, and a short list of foods they hoped hadn't gone bad. At the heart of nearly every meal was pottage, a kind of eternal stew that never truly finished cooking. It wasn't ever fully fresh, nor completely gone. They added to it as the day went on, skimmed from it at night, kept it warm as seasons changed, and quietly prayed that nothing strange had taken root in it while their back was turned. What went into it? Whatever was available, which, more often than not, wasn't much. A fortunate day might offer cabbage, leeks, barley, or a few legumes. Perhaps onions or garlic, if the garden had been kind. In colder months, dried peas or beans took over. If fortune smiled, a shred of salted pork made it in. More often, it was just a leftover bone. Even that was cherished. A single bone could be boiled for days, drawing out a flavour that barely remembered meat. The taste never changed. It was earthy, grey. Less a flavour and more a temperature. They didn't eat it for joy, they ate it because it was what they had. A hot bowl at night meant more than warmth. It meant they'd made it through another day. The pot was never truly clean. It might be wiped, maybe scraped, but rarely scrubbed. Each batch carried the ghost of the one before. No spice covered it, no vinegar brightened it, only that slow, reliable dullness, a flavour that resembled boiled memory. Bread was the other staple, not soft or golden or sweet, but thick, heavy and dark. Made of barley, rye or oats, white wheat was for the wealthy. Most peasants never even saw it, let alone used it. Their loaves were small, dense, and barely rose at all. They crumbled fast if left out for a single day, and could just as easily be mistaken for a blunt weapon. But the bread filled their bellies and served as something to soak up stew. Sometimes it was made from questionable mixtures, poor quality flours, ground peas, leftover chaff, or whatever was scraped from the bottom of the miller's barrel. During lean times, people didn't just stretch ingredients, they turned to tree bark. Not metaphorically, they ground the inner bark into powder and mixed it with what little flour remained. What came out of the oven was famine bread, bitter, heavy, and nearly impossible to digest. But it kept them alive. At least technically. When flour itself ran low, they used trenches, slices of stale bread repurposed as edible plates. These caught the drippings from stew and were either eaten at the end or tossed to the animals. Sometimes they were handed down the table to someone of lower rank. Bread, it seemed, had its own social ladder. Protein was a rarity, a true rarity. Chickens provided eggs, cows gave milk. But the animals themselves were not eaten unless there was no other way. And if they did have to slaughter something, every part was used. Meat, fat, organs, even bones. Blood became pudding. Fat was rendered down. The head might be used in soup. Nothing was thrown away. Pork was the most accessible meat when it could be found. Pigs were efficient animals, and their salted fat lent flavour to otherwise bland meals, transforming the barely edible into the marginally enjoyable. But slaughtering a pig was a major decision. It required weeks of preparation, salting, hanging, boiling, and storing. Fishing was possible, but only for those living near water. Even then, rivers and lakes were often under noble control. Fishing without permission wasn't just frowned upon. It could lead to steep fines, or worse. The fish they did catch were humble: eels, small river fish, anything that wouldn't rot by nightfall. Salted herring, if it could be acquired, was considered a treasure. Religion had a strong say in their meals too. On Fridays and during Lent, meat was off limits, so they turned to fish, or simply went without. In creative interpretations of church doctrine, even beaver tails were considered fish, a loophole few contested, as it meant something to chew. Milk was more common, though it didn't last long. It had to be consumed quickly or turned into butter or cheese. Butter was a luxury, used in small amounts. Cheese was tougher, tangier, and often quite dry. A few wheels stored in the loft meant a generous cow that year. Still, dairy came with risks. There was no way to keep it cool. Milk turned sour, butter went rancid, cheese moulded. They cut off the bad bits and hoped their stomachs could handle the rest. Drinks were basic. Water wasn't always reliable. It could be unsafe depending on the season or the habits of someone living upstream. So ale became the norm. Weak ale or small beer was brewed at home and sipped daily. It was consumed by everyone, even the children. The alcohol content was low, just enough to kill off bacteria and take the edge off thirst. If they had access to apples or pears, they might press cider. Wine belonged to the nobility and clergy. Mead was rare. Milk was mostly for the very young or the unwell. Otherwise, it was ale with breakfast, ale at midday, and more ale to help forget that tomorrow would taste much the same as today. Vegetables made up the majority of their meals: cabbage, onions, garlic, turnips, leeks, and carrots. Not the orange carrots we know now, but pale or purple ones. Most of these were grown in modest garden plots, carefully tended, eaten from root to leaf. Nothing was discarded. Even the tops of turnips might become boiled greens. Peels could be composted, or simply burned. Fruits were strictly seasonal, mostly apples, sometimes wild berries or small plums. If they could be dried, they'd last through winter. Otherwise, they had to be eaten quickly. Preservation was tricky. Sugar was unattainable. If they had bees, honey was a prize, a rare sweetness. Without it, the stew remained savoury, in the broadest and most forgiving use of the word. Herbs were grown where possible: parsley, sage, dill, mint. Their purpose leaned more toward medicine or folklore than flavour. Some herbs were thought to guard against disease, others kept insects away. Occasionally they made food taste better, though that was more coincidence than intent. Meals were shared, seated on benches near the hearth. There were no formal courses, no instructions written down, just a pot, a piece of bread, and the wish that something would remain for the next day. Complaining had no place. It didn't thicken the stew. If there was a celebration, a wedding, a festival, a saint's feast, a bird might be roasted or a pie prepared, not the golden, flaky sort. A medieval pie was a heavy container of dough, used to seal in a meat filling. Spices, if anyone had traded wisely, might include pepper, ginger, or cinnamon. But they were rare luxuries. Most days weren't feast days. Most days were still. They scraped their bowls, dipped bread in broth, sipped weak ale, and leaned back, not satisfied, but full enough to last until morning. There was comfort in the familiar, in knowing the flavour of the pot, in counting the bread, in watching the same hands stir the same meal by the same fire. As wind moved through the gaps in the wall and animals shifted in sleep, the stew simmered, the bread cooled, and once again they had enough. For a medieval peasant, possessions were few. Maybe a plot of soil, some tools, a few animals, and a crooked shelter built by hand. But none of it, not really, belonged to them. It all belonged to the Lord. Not a king, not... It wasn't someone mythical or far away. It was their local landholder, the one who lived just up the hill in a house that leaned slightly less, who ate slightly better food, and whose roof, more often than not, didn't drip. He owned the land. And because of that, he owned everything upon it, including, in a way, them. They were known as villains, not an insult, a legal category. They worked the land, but it wasn't theirs. They were bound to it. Leaving required permission. Passing it on wasn't a right. They owed labour, goods, and respect. They weren't enslaved, but they weren't truly free either. Their connection to the Lord wasn't conversational. It was transactional. They didn't speak to him directly. They dealt with the steward, the man who oversaw the estate, and, more importantly, tracked what each person owed. And they owed a great deal. Start with labour. Several days each week, more during harvest, they were expected to toil in the Lord's fields instead of their own. This was corvée labour. No wages, no gratitude, just the knowledge that somewhere in the manor house someone was fed because of their efforts. Then came the taxes. These arrived in every imaginable form. A portion of their grain, some of their wool, a chicken now and then, a few eggs when available. If they brewed ale, they owed some. If they raised pigs, part of the bacon belonged to the Lord. Even fish, if they caught any, technically came from his river. And it didn't stop with food. Using the mill, that cost a fee, even though the mill was the only way to grind grain, and the Lord owned it and set the price. Grinding at home was tempting, but often forbidden, punishable by fines or worse. Control mattered as much as payment. Baking too had rules. Many manors had a communal oven. Use it and pay. Try to bake at home, and if the steward found out, expect consequences. They learned over time to follow the official path, even when it was slower, more costly, and rarely made sense. Then there were the fees. Marrying, pay a fee. Inheriting a father's land, another fee. Thinking of moving to a different village, first ask, then, of course, pay. Livestock could be taxed. Tools, sometimes two. Even the right to have children could require permission. And in return, in theory, protection. If bandits attacked or another lord launched an incursion, their own lord might send men-at-arms to defend them. In times of famine, he might share grain, though seldom without strings. If there was a dispute, say, a goat refusing to leave their garden, the Lord's court could resolve it. Again, not for free. This was feudalism. A system built on layers of duty and rank, wrapped tightly in the language of loyalty and... In theory, it was protection. In practice, it was a structure rooted in ownership. Land meant power. Those who held it gave orders. Those who tilled it followed them. The manor itself stood apart, often literally was, on raised ground. Built from timber or stone, it was far larger than any peasant dwelling, with a thatched roof packed thick enough to silence even the wind. Inside, the walls bore tapestries. Long tables stood ready, servants moved about. And the Lord, of course, lived there, draped in wool lined with fur, enjoying meals beyond most imagining, and rarely, if ever, thinking of them. He might not know their names, but he knew their numbers, how many measures of barley they owed, how many eggs they'd promised, whether a son had grown old enough to be added to the labour rolls. Everything was documented. Not by them, of course. They couldn't read, but others could. The steward, the reeve, the bailiff. Men who carried wax tablets or scraps of parchment, showing up with questions that had to be answered carefully. If obligations weren't met, there were consequences. Fines, typically. More goods taken. Extra labour assigned. In harsher cases, tools could be seized. Land revoked. Even the house, the goats, dignity itself, all could vanish. They didn't rebel. Resistance wasn't considered bravery. It was seen as folly. And yet, oddly, the system functioned, not from fairness, but from predictability. Its rules, though stern, were consistent. They knew what was expected, what was owed. No guessing games, no sudden shifts, just an ongoing rhythm of giving, and giving more. And once in a while, only now and then, something was returned, perhaps a feast where food was shared, a holiday when labour was paused, a kind word, tossed casually from horseback. It wasn't enough to make things fair, but it was enough to stop them from crumbling. The relationship wasn't warm, but it endured. Lords changed. Some were aged, others youthful. Some just, others cruel. Present or distant, they remained above. And that order was not questioned. When he rode past, they bowed. Caps were removed. The proper words were spoken, not always because he had earned them, but because they wished to avoid trouble. And maybe, deep within, a faint hope flickered, that someday, somehow, someone might notice, might reward them, might lift them, even a little. It almost never happened. Yet that sliver of hope was what kept the structure intact. Not just fear, but the lingering sense that loyalty, effort, and prayer could lead to change. Meanwhile, the steward walked his rounds. The reeve marked his notes, the millstones turned, and they, again, pressed their hands into the soil. Year after year, season after season. There were no retirements, no bonuses, no rising above, just the quiet certainty that they had done their part. That they had done what was asked. They had endured another year beneath the weight of someone else's title. And as long as the Lord remained content, they were permitted to carry on, to keep living. Long before the Black Death carved its name into European memory, medieval peasants already knew sickness well. Not just the seasonal colds and coughs, though those were plentiful, but the slow, steady threat of illness always lurking nearby. Infection, fever, swelling, wasting. Coughs that deepened, lingered, and never quite left. Disease wasn't a sudden crisis. It was simply part of life. No great plague was needed to bring someone down. A small wound, a single flea, a sip of water that looked clean but wasn't. That was enough. And unlike weather or taxation, illness followed no logic. It gave no warning and rarely left without leaving something behind. There weren't hospitals. Not truly. If they were fortunate, the village had a wise woman, maybe a midwife, someone who knew which herbs to steep in water and which to burn in smoke. If fortune really smiled, a monk lived nearby, literate, kind, and only slightly more effective than whispered prayers. But for the most part, when they grew ill, they stayed where they were, in bed, sweating through fabric, hoping. They didn't understand disease, not in the way we do now. The word germ didn't exist. Microscopes were still a dream centuries away. What they had were theories, ancient ones muddled and often mistaken. Some believed in miasma, that foul-smelling air could carry sickness. If a village reeked of rot, manure and smoke, it was assumed to be dangerous. And in a sense, they weren't entirely wrong, though not for the reasons they imagined. To fight the bad air, people stuffed herbs into sleeves, carried flowers close to their noses, or held vinegar-soaked cloths against their mouths. Unpleasant, ineffective, but deeply trusted. Others believed sickness was divine punishment, retribution for sinful thoughts, disobedience, or moral failure. If a child fell ill, it was a test. If crops withered and the body weakened soon after, someone must have done wrong. Perhaps them, perhaps their neighbour. There were other traditions too. Some blamed the evil eye, a jealous glance from someone bitter. Others cited moon phases, angry saints, or spirits of animals. One especially popular belief held that illness entered through the soles of the feet. The remedy? Boil them. If that failed, burn something close, maybe even the bedding. The cures could be just as strange as the causes. A high fever? They might be bled. A local man would arrive with a knife, a bowl, and far more confidence than skill. Sometimes leeches were applied. Other times, sharp stones. The aim was to restore balance in the body, to bring the humours back into alignment. The humours, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, were believed to govern everything. When they fell out of balance, so did the person. No one had ever actually seen these humours, yet they were held responsible for nearly all ailments. For swelling, people applied poultices, crushed herbs, mud, or even pieces of bread wrapped in cloth and tied to the skin. Some treatments helped, most didn't. A few even made things worse. But the important part was that something was being done. If their stomach ached, they might chew on charcoal. If they coughed blood, they could be given wine mixed with powdered pearls. When vision blurred, someone might recite a prayer while blowing smoke gently over their head. If a limb turned black, however, there were likely no remedies left. Then came the plague charms. Bits of bone or metal strung around the neck, sometimes carved with sacred words, sometimes blessed by clergy. Some buried onions in the corners of the room. Others hung garlic above their doorways. One widely known cure involved tying a live chicken to the infected limb, hoping the disease would pass into the bird. It rarely did. But in times of despair, people held tightly to hope, however strange its form. Illness was isolating, though not in the modern sense. There was no quarantine, no summoning of aid. They simply kept working, until they couldn't. And when that point arrived, they lay down. Life continued around them, Children were fed, animals were tended, they might be offered broth. A few whispered prayers, nothing more. Sometimes illness receded. A fever would break, swelling reduced. They'd walk again, slowly, perhaps with a limp and a newfound gratitude for hot soup. Other times it did not, and a candle would be lit in their memory. Plague in the broad sense wasn't always the dramatic scene of bodies piled into carts. More often it was a creeping infection, skin darkening, limbs inflamed, a cough so deep it seemed to shake the walls themselves. Diseases like smallpox, dysentery, leprosy, or even the common flu could sweep through a village and leave half its people confined to their beds. There were no statistics, no records, just word of mouth. A traveller saying the cough had appeared in a neighbouring village, or a whisper that 3 children had passed near the river. People listened. They began boiling their water, slipped herbs under the doorframe, kept their distance even when no one explained why. Death wasn't feared in the way we fear it now, but it was familiar and its signs were understood. Breathing that slowed, skin growing cold, eyes losing their light. There were prayers for the dying. Soft ones murmured beside the fire. And when the Black Death did arrive in the 14th century, it struck harder than anything before it. But the world already knew what it meant to be unwell in the morning and gone by night. What changed was the speed. The plague returned in waves, each stronger, stranger, with swellings rose in the neck and groin. Fevers stole reason. Blood darkened, bubbled. Some perished within days. Others faded in hours. Entire villages disappeared. Fields stood empty, and the church bells tolled too often. A few peasants tried to flee, but illness moved faster than footsteps. Others turned inward, to faith, doubling their prayers, flagellating themselves, vowing to live differently if only they might be spared. Some lashed outward, blaming strangers, blaming sinners, blaming anyone except the wind. The church provided both comfort and answers, and, when needed, burials. Monks died in clusters, priests vanished. In many towns, death became so familiar that funerals were skipped. The dead were laid in mass graves, often nameless. And yet life found a way forward. People adapted to sickness the way they did to cold or hunger. Not with joy, but with weary determination. They swept their homes more often, they shared herbs, they whispered new prayers, hoping they would help. Some believed that enduring one illness might protect them from the next. Others believed in nothing, but still rose with the sun and milked the cow. Children were raised learning which plants to chew, which to boil until the smell faded, and which to leave alone. They were taught how to bind a wound, how to wait through a fever, and how to tell when healing wasn't coming, and when to let go of hope. And even so, they did not stop living. They married, they harvested what they could. Meals were shared, however modest. They gathered by the hearth and repeated the stories of sicknesses past, of how someone's grandfather had survived winter fever with nothing but garlic water and grit. The plague wasn't the world's end. It was simply another part of the world. For those who remained, survival itself became a form of defiance, a quiet, persistent refusal to vanish, a belief that tomorrow would arrive, and if it didn't, someone would recall their name, or at least remember how they always added rosemary to the broth. Night in the medieval countryside was not peaceful. It was quiet in the way a cave is quiet, filled with distant creaks, animal rustles, and the kind of stillness that made one aware of the sound of one's own breath. Day ended when the light faded. Everything not yet finished had to be quickly done, because once night came, the world narrowed, reduced to the boundaries of their hearth. There were no electric lights. Candles didn't burn freely. Wax was too precious. A tallow lamp might be lit, but only in emergencies or for prayer. Most evenings ended in firelight. The flames dulled, embers pulsed gently, and that was enough. And then they slept. But not in the way we sleep now. Not in a single unbroken span. In the medieval world, sleep came in 2 acts, a first sleep, followed by a waking interval, and then a return to rest. That rhythm, this wasn't accidental. It was simply how they adjusted to the long, dark hours stretched between dusk and dawn. They would ease into the first sleep not long after sunset. The fire would be banked. The animals stilled. Children quieted. The home, one room, maybe two, would settle into hush and shadow. If they were fortunate, their mattress was filled with straw or feathers. Lumpy, perhaps, but better than nothing. If not, they lay on woven rushes or directly on the floor, softened only by familiarity. Everyone slept in the same space. Parents, children, distant kin, even servants. Not for affection, but for warmth. It was the only heated room in the home. On the harshest nights, animals joined them inside. A goat stationed by the door, a dog curled beside the hearth. Chickens clucked softly from a basket. Heat mattered more than privacy. Sleeping alone wasn't comforting. It was a punishment, a mark of separation. The wealthy could afford solitude. The rest adapted. They turned to face the wall. They stuffed straw in their ears. Blankets were shared. So was breath. And if someone snored, and someone always did, they learned to accept it. First sleep lasted a few hours. Then, as if on cue, they would stir. This waking was not disrupted. It was natural. Around midnight, the world held a special stillness. Some would pray, others tended to the fire. Some relieved themselves or stepped into the bitter cold outside. Some sat in silence. Some whispered. It was a time for dreams, vivid, strange, powerful. Many believed this waking interval thinned the boundary between the sacred and the ordinary, between the living and those who had passed on. Dreams dreamt in that hour were remembered and discussed, not lightly but with weight. Eventually second sleep came. It was slower, deeper. This was the stretch meant to restore them, when aches might fade a little and the sting of blisters cooled. If the night was kind, they slept straight through. If not, they waited quietly for morning to give them reason to rise. But silence was never absolute. The fire murmured in its ashes. Wind slipped through the thatch. A baby might cry. A cow might stir. At times the night was pierced by coughing, the wet rattling kind that dragged on without end. Everyone heard it. No one spoke. They all understood. Fear of the dark was not superstition. It was rooted in something real. Night held dangers, imagined and tangible alike. Wolves, for example. In certain places their howls reached the edges of the village, close enough to raise the hairs along the neck. They weren't just beasts. They weren't the creatures of myth. They were real, and they were hungry. But it wasn't just wolves that haunted the night. There were thieves, wandering strangers, fires sparked by a forgotten coal, roofs groaning under too much snow, and then things less explainable, ghosts, spirits, witches, and shadows that didn't belong. People didn't speak of them directly, but they believed. To guard the home, they followed quiet rituals. An iron nail by the door, a cross traced gently above the hearth. Soft blessings murmured over straw beds. Bundles of rosemary, sage, or rue hanging above entryways. A string tied around a child's wrist, just in case. Even with such protections, many believed sleep left the soul exposed, drifting while the body lay still. So precautions were taken. Mirrors were covered. Beds turned toward the fire, never the door. Feet were not allowed to point outward. These things mattered. The cold, too, was its own kind of danger. It crept in through cracks in stone and through poorly sealed thatch. They didn't sleep beneath piles of bedding. Instead they layered. Wool, cloaks, tunics, even old coats. The idea of undressing for sleep would have seemed foolish. Most nights they slept in their clothes, sometimes even in boots. There was comfort in sleeping close to others, but also discomfort. Someone always moved. Someone whispered in their dreams. Elbows found ribs, knees bumped knees. The dog might shift unexpectedly, yet none of it was unusual. Silence wasn't expected, togetherness was. And in that closeness they found a kind of safety. They heard a father's breath, a child's soft whimper, a grandmother's prayer whispered into her dreams. It wasn't restful in the way we think of peace, but it was human, it was shared. Dreams mattered. A golden field of wheat might mean abundance, a snake, illness, a broken tooth could foretell death. They learned to read these signs. Or they sought someone who could. Every village had its dream readers. Not formally, but everyone knew who to trust. The church had its warnings. Some dreams, it said, came from the devil. Sleep was a vulnerable state. Temptation could slip in. People were told to pray before lying down, to keep their thoughts pure, to prepare their souls, just in case the night was their last. Because sometimes it was. A person might fall asleep and never wake. A fever could creep in silently. A cough might worsen in the night. And by morning someone might be gone. Quiet, as if taken. That uncertainty made each sunrise feel like a small blessing. When light crept in, when roosters cried, when the coals were stirred back to flame, it meant they had made it through again. They sat up slowly. Every joint reminded them of the years, no matter how few. The air stung their faces. They wiped their eyes, looked around, counted movement. Each stirring body was noted. Those who didn't stir were gently checked, and only once the living were accounted for, the day would begin. Water was drawn, bread prepared, animals were tended. If they had dreamed, and if the dream had meaning, it was shared aloud, then tucked quietly away as the hours unfolded. The memory of night didn't vanish. It simply softened, blending into the next stretch of time. In winter, sleep arrived early and lingered long. In summer, it shortened. But the rhythm held steady. First sleep. A waking pause. Second sleep. No clocks, yet full of habit. And despite the discomfort, there was something grounding in that pattern. Something plain-spoken, something real. They didn't pursue comfort, they pursued survival. And if rest came anyway, if warmth found them, or a night passed without noise, or a dream ended gently, it was a gift. One not questioned, one never expected to come too soon. Some years they were simply hungry, other years it was famine. The two were not the same. Hunger could be reasoned with. It had rules. Food could be stretched, meals rationed, hopes held. But famine rewrote everything. When the crops failed, when the cellar emptied, when the pretending couldn't continue, food became more of an idea than a reality. In a medieval village, they often saw it creeping in. It started in spring. Too much rain. Or not enough. The barley pushed through patchy and pale. The beans bloomed, then withered. Cabbages burst too early. Wheat heads bowed short, like they already grieved what wouldn't be. Everyone noticed. At first no one spoke, but glances were traded. Quiet mental math began. How much grain remained from last year? How many seeds could they spare? How much could they safely eat? The answers were rarely good. The hardest part wasn't winter, it was summer. Because summer required choice. They had to decide, plant the seed, or grind it into flour. Gamble on a harvest, or feed their child a final warm bowl of something today. So the portions shrank, stew grew thinner, bread smaller, bowls returned but less frequently. Not empty, just emptier. Panic hadn't set in yet. They reminded themselves this had happened once before. Maybe another village had surplus. Maybe the manor stores could bridge the gap. There was still hope, just not much else. By August, the signs could no longer be ignored. By September, they were undeniable. The animals were no longer fed first. Chickens went quiet. The bleating of goats turned hollow. The dog, if they had one, stopped barking. It followed closely now, as if it understood its place in the line. Bread became ceremony. One loaf divided 5 ways. Every bite was slow. No one commented on the crust. Even the tiniest crumb was gathered with care. And the stew? The stew had become mostly water. If there was any colour, it came from the pot. They boiled weeds, crushed roots, unearthed things they couldn't name, and hoped they weren't poisonous. Some turned out fine, some didn't. They didn't sleep soundly. Not from fear, but because hunger tapped gently at them every few hours, reminding them it was still there. The children asked fewer questions. That's how they knew it had become real. They didn't ask when bread would return. They didn't mention honey. They didn't plead for stories. They simply sat by the fire and stared. Waiting became instinct. And the neighbours? They stopped appearing. The village grew quiet. No more laughter along the lane, no more arguments about sheep, only the occasional cough or the sharp snap of firewood splitting. Famine didn't always harden people, it just made them quiet. Once in a while someone returned with a rabbit or a bird or a few acorns to soak and grind. They chewed them, even when bitterness lingered. They smiled, not for taste, but because it was something. They tried not to resent the manner. Sometimes grain came. Other times, nothing. The steward visited less frequently. A blessing and a burden. Good, because he wasn't there to take. Bad, because he wasn't there to give. His silence said more than his words ever had. The church did what it could. Bread after Mass. Alms for those most in need. But they too were stretched thin. Prayers were said more often. Not out of hope, but habit. Words were easier than labour, when hands no longer had the strength to hold tools. Some packed up and left, searching for food, for work, for God. A few came back, many did not. No one asked where they'd gone. Everyone was too exhausted. The body changed in famine. They didn't feel their ribs from the outside, but from within, like bones pressing closer to the skin. They rose more slowly, bruised more easily, woke with fists clenched, as though still gripping tools they no longer used. The cold bit deeper. The fire became their companion. More time was spent feeding flames than cooking over them. They sat beside it, slept facing it, fed it even as their own hunger deepened, because warmth was the last comfort they could still provide. By now they had eaten all that could be eaten. Roots, weeds, dried beans, stale flour. Bones had been boiled again and again. Bark soaked. Famine bread baked so hard it cracked a tooth. And when the food was gone, their eyes turned toward things that weren't food, but might become food if seen in the right light. Leather, boiled and salted, not tasty, not filling, but technically chewable. Once they found a rat. They didn't scream, they thanked God, then cooked it in secret, told no one. Still the guilt lingered, but not regret. And then the dreams came, strange ones, dreams of banquets, tables heavy with roast bread and wine. They woke jaw moving, chewing their... They dreamed of tongues moving, of tasting things that hadn't been boiled in days. In their sleep they imagined pots bubbling again, over and over. They saw animals returning, green shoots breaking through melting snow. They dreamed of childhood, a time when hunger had rules, when it was still simple. And on rare nights they dreamed of being full. Those were the nights they woke up crying. The graveyard expanded, slowly at first, then quickly, then so fast they could no longer keep pace. They knew someone had passed not by the sound of the bell, but by its silence. A silence that meant no one had the strength left to pull the rope. Graves were shallow, prayers were brief, grief was quiet. Everyone had hunger to tend to. They wanted to grieve but couldn't afford it. Like so much else, mourning had to be rationed, tucked away, saved for later. And then, as with every famine, the ending arrived. Not all at once, but gradually. Rain returned, it lingered, the earth softened, seeds sprouted, plants reached upward, fragile but real. Hope, once buried, began to stir again. They saved the first harvest, not for themselves, for others. Children first, then the elders. They took the smallest portion, passed the bowl with a smile. When the first real loaf emerged from the oven, cracked across the top, dark along the bottom, they stared at it for a long time before they touched it. They remembered each empty day, every trick they'd used, every quiet lie they told to protect someone else. This time when they ate, it filled them. By the time they could stand again, the church had long since claimed them. It had written their name at baptism, breathed Latin over their heads, words they couldn't translate, tied their soul into something far bigger than their field, their house, their village. They belonged to the church, not out of choice, but because no other option existed. In the quiet edges of life, before the fire caught in the morning, or in damp night hours when wind seeped through shutters, they felt its presence, like gravity. It didn't sit beside their life. It arranged it, judged it, forgave it, taxed it, promised to explain what came next. The church wasn't simply a building. It was the shape of the year, the road beneath their feet, the breath over their cradle, and the whisper beside their grave. The village priest, often the only one who could read, was more than a confessor. He was a timekeeper, a guide, and the closest thing to an oracle they knew. He understood the sky's moods, the saints' tales. He might know why a pig died, or why a storm brewed. He walked the village as someone carrying both comfort and warning, robes brushing mud and blessing alike. They brought him their sins in whispers, hoping he wouldn't frown. They avoided thinking too long about what he might know. They saw him at birth, at weddings, at graveside. The three unchanging ceremonies of a peasant's life. And in between, he spoke on behalf of a God they feared. More than they loved, because love, they were taught, required obedience. Latin echoed through the Mass like a spell, spoken but never fully understood. They stood shoulder to shoulder with kin, feet numb from stone-cold floors, listening to words that did not belong to them. They didn't grasp what the priest uttered as he raised the bread, but they believed, or tried to. Something unseen had occurred. The bread had changed. The wine too. The murmured phrases and practiced gestures had summoned something sacred. They couldn't say the words, but the words still passed through them. They mouthed what they could, crossed themselves in unison with others, and absorbed the rhythm of worship the way one learns a footpath to water, not by logic, but by need. The church dictated their seasons, when to abstain, when to rejoice. It sliced the year into holy fragments, Lent, Advent, Epiphany, All Saints. They didn't say March or April, they said after Easter or near St. Michael's. It told them what to eat, when to eat, and how much guilt should linger afterward. 40 days of abstinence before Easter, followed by a feast so rich it left them lightheaded. Fish on Fridays, whether or not a river ran nearby. Almond milk, if one had coin. For most it was turnips and thin broth. On saints' days they shared what little could be spared. On fasting days they imagined what they could not have. Even with an empty bowl, the table overflowed, with rules. Their calendar served not just faith, but finances. The church demanded 1/10 of all their yield, season after season. Grain, eggs, wool, chickens, cider. If it sprouted from their soil or came from their labour, it had a tithe. They gave it because it was deemed God's share. That's what they'd been told. But God didn't collect it. The priest did. Or else the steward, with parchment and a nod that said little and meant much. They watched their finest barley roll toward the tithe barn, which always towered larger than their cottage. They saw neighbours hand over their last sack of oats, while a prayer was muttered for mercy. Mercy they had just bought. When the harvest failed, when rain delayed or frost came early, the demands held steady. They owed what they owed. Sometimes candles or labour were accepted in place of crops, other times not. Sometimes the debt became a burden too great to see, but not too great to feel in the spine. Still, the church gave, in its own way, not always what was asked for, but something. It gave stories, it gave a framework, it offered reasons when reason fled. If a cow collapsed with no clear cause, the priest would suggest which saint to beg. If a child weakened, he'd say it might be a trial, a punishment, or perhaps the devil slipping in through a chink in their belief. He gave blessings and sacraments, told them to light candles, visit shrines. And sometimes, quietly, he handed them a scrap of a relic, perhaps a fragment of bone, a tooth, or a scrap of ribbon soaked in the blood of some long-forgotten martyr, was held like a treasure. Sometimes it brought relief, sometimes it did not. But even when it failed, it was more comforting than having nothing at all. There were saints for every ailment. Saint Apollonia for toothaches, Saint Isidore for fields and ploughs, Saint Sebastian for outbreaks of plague. They did not know where these saints rested or when they had lived. They only remembered the names and what each could mend. Their tales, told beside fires that sputtered and hissed, were part memory, part enchantment, passed on by those who couldn't tell where history ended and wonder began. These names were whispered when nothing else remained. Whispered while turning a pot. Whispered while kneeling in the dirt. Promises were made. A loaf of bread, a period of fasting, a journey on foot. In exchange for help. Just once. Sometimes the plea was answered, or seemed to be. That was reason enough to ask again. A pilgrimage was a sacred duty, but also, quietly, a way to step beyond the same 5 miles they had walked their whole lives. They wandered roads unfamiliar, heading towards shrines known only from stories. They brought their prayers along, tucked in satchels or gripped tightly with calloused hands. Nights were spent beneath hedgerows or in the corners of barns, feet blistered, bodies ached. Yet when they finally reached the relic, be it a statue, a bone, or a glimmering object behind glass, something shifted inside them. Perhaps not a cure, but a change. Or enough exhaustion to convince them it had mattered. Even death was wrapped in ritual, a final act guided by the church. When its nearness was felt, someone summoned the priest. He would arrive with oils and prayer, marking the forehead, speaking words over the departing body, guiding the soul as best he could toward what lay beyond. Family gathered, candles were lit. If someone had strength enough, the bell would toll. The body was laid in consecrated earth, among others who had trodden similar paths. Then came the masses. More candles were lit, more coins passed hands. And all the while the family hoped that the priest would recall the name in his chants. For even in death, obligations endured. The church taught that not all souls went directly to paradise. Many waited in purgatory, a shadowy space between agony and absolution. That waiting could last decades, centuries, or far longer, unless someone intervened, unless someone prayed, or paid, or lit enough candles, unless someone spoke the name enough times to pull the soul through. And so families gave what they had. The poor offered loaves, the wealthy gave land. All of it spent trying to shorten the unseen torment of a place no one had ever visited but all feared. For fear, too, was part of what the church offered. It explained the world when others fell silent. It spoke of why storms came, why children failed to wake, why the ill perished and the wicked remained. It told them that pain held meaning, that devotion had its prize. It gave shape to a world often ruled by chaos. And that shape, even when harsh, was something they could hold. Burdened, they gave. What they received in return was not comfort, but a kind of peace. They never truly challenged the church's power. Not openly, not with real intent. Perhaps they muttered complaints about the tithe or swore under their breath when the priest looked away. But still they kept returning. They continued to kneel. They continued to cross themselves at the sound of the bell. For if the church had no truth, then the world itself held no shape, and a world without shape was a frightening thing, even when the priest drank more than he should, even when the bishop's demands felt endless, even when a pardoner rolled through town, his cart filled with promises and his purse filled with silver, they still held to belief, or acted as though they did. And in many ways that was enough. For belief in their world was less about what dwelled in the mind and more about what the hands and body chose to do. They didn't comprehend the Latin, but they knew the rhythm. They stayed within it because there was no other path. And when death approached, they prayed the bells would toll, the candles would glow, and their names would be spoken often enough to be remembered. They hoped the saints were still listening. They hoped that each sin had been counted, and that forgiveness would be weighed just the same. They placed their trust in the church, with all its grandeur, shadow, incense, weight, and whispers, to carry them the rest of the way. One might imagine that after everything they had suffered, after enduring famine, pestilence, burdensome tithes, crushing taxes, and the unyielding boot of authority, peasants would have risen more often, that centuries of pain would eventually press so hard they would snap. That one frozen morning the frost would melt not only from the fields but from their restraint, and they would rise, that they would gather with tools in hand and fire behind their ribs, calling out they would kneel no more. But they did not, or not often, not for long, and never all at once. There were rebellions, yes, the Peasants' Revolt in England in 1381, the Jacquerie in France some years earlier, smaller fires across Europe, flashes of rage like stones skipping across still water, voices raised where the pressure had built too high, where taxes scraped bone, where injustice pushed one step too far. Sometimes the spark caught, a taxman's home set alight, a steward chased away, a banner lifted into the grey sky. But those fires burned out quickly, and when they did, gallows rose in village squares, executions followed, and the silence that returned was heavier than before. The world did not shift. The grain still had to be planted. To understand why these people didn't revolt more, one must stop seeing them as foolish or fearful. They were neither. They were resilient. Not the kind of resilience built after one terrible season, but the quiet, aching kind that endures year after year. They had learned to live with ceilings low enough to make hope feel like a luxury. Hope for them was not free. It had to be rationed, like bread. Grain was not something they lacked bravery for. It was margin they lacked. When every single day revolved around mending leaks in the roof and keeping the broth from burning, there was simply no room left for revolt. They could plan an uprising or they could harvest potatoes, not both. The truth remained that the system didn't endure because it was righteous, gentle, or effective. It endured because it was old. Its roots had woven deep into the routines of those who came before. It didn't require explanation. It was simply there. Labour was expected. Grain was owed. A tenth belonged to the church. The rest went to the Lord. A silent nod was given when the reeve walked past. They were born into these obligations. And unless fate was unusually kind, they passed away still within them. Yet by staying within those invisible lines, one could survive. Just barely, perhaps, but survival all the same. To step outside meant danger too great. The manor had armed men. The church held excommunication. And though the king knew nothing of their faces, his laws bound them as tightly as any rope. Punishment did not always mean death. Sometimes worse. Banishment. Starvation. Leaving one's family behind, shackled by a debt that couldn't be outrun. Everyone had heard the tales. A father seized in the night, a mother lashed for speaking out, a cousin who vanished after refusing to pay. These were not whispered to inspire rebellion, but to stop it from taking root. Revolting didn't seem like a choice at all. After all, those around them weren't strangers. They were siblings, cousins, friends. The same people they tilled beside, mended tools with, leaned on when winter bit too deep. Even if one despised the steward, they might still end up wedding his daughter. Even if the tithe brought resentment, they still carried bread to the altar. The village was not a place one simply walked away from, and certainly not one to unravel without unspooling their own life in the process. To stand against the manor meant standing against the cadence of their own days. It's tempting, centuries on, to paint peasants as eternally bowed figures, hat in hand and voice silenced. But that image misses the deeper truth. Submission was not the same as servitude. It was closer to quiet negotiation. Most did not simply endure, they learned how to adjust. They haggled, they bent, they found loopholes and built small freedoms in the spaces between the rules. A pig left off the count, a secret stash of rye buried before the census, a favour traded in eggs instead of coins. These were the revolts they could afford. Acts of practicality more than defiance. Ideals didn't guide them, the weather did. The question was never, what is fair, but always, will this carry us through the frost? Justice, if it ever came, was not something they trusted. Lords came and went, priests were swapped, rules twisted. But the wind kept blowing, the earth still needed to be tilled, and their children's cries still echoed. One did not revolt against these things. One endured them. And the church, for all its weight, played its part as well. Perhaps more than they realized. More effectively than force, it was belief that taught them suffering held virtue, that endurance carried righteousness, that the humble would someday inherit the earth, even if no one said when. They were led to believe that hardship was not retribution, but purification, that obedience would bring rewards, though not here, only in the life beyond. And when heaven's promise felt too distant, the threat of damnation filled the silence. Flames, torment, gnashing of teeth, waiting for the bold, the defiant, the ones who dared to resist. Yet these villagers were never fully passive. Their defiance was quiet, whispered, shared in glances and songs. They mocked the stewards in gossip. They sang crude verses about their lord's peculiar habits. They chuckled when the priest lost his place mid-sermon. At night they passed stories of days that had been kinder and of men who had been better. Their dignity lingered in the smallest things. A piece of bread split without a word, a silence shared at just the right moment, a furrowed field planted slightly against the guidelines. Their rebellion was not dramatic. It lived in the way they endured, not because they embraced the order, but because they bent it just enough to breathe. Now and then the world shifted. A lord passed, and his heir proved gentler. A new bishop arrived and forgave old debts. A violent storm reminded the mighty that even they were not beyond nature's reach. But such changes descended from above. The villagers' task remained steady, to endure, to pass along what little they owned, and to raise their children to stay quiet when they must, and to be courageous when the moment allowed. And yes, there were dreams, always dreams. Though they might not have called it uprising, they imagined a life that felt different, a time when their children might not carry the same weight, a future where no one came knocking with a list of names, a day when their backs didn't ache by age 30, and sleep came without fear, of wolves, soldiers, or frost. Those dreams kept them moving, not because they expected them to come true, but because the dreams helped them stay alive. What remains most remarkable isn't how rarely they rose up, but how deeply they managed to preserve their way of life. Their stories, their beliefs, their families, they endured under the crushing weight of the world. They kept songs alive without ever writing them down. They passed tales from one hearth to another. They remembered which herbs soothed wounds and which didn't. They taught one another how to whisper prayers, deliver babies, and bury the departed. They wove together a thread of culture that lasted longer than kings or crusades. And they did so not through banners or war, but through patience. Persistence itself became their resistance. When the manor asked too much, they endured. When the church taxed their sins, they still lit their candles. And when the world turned against them, they leaned into one another, held tight, and waited for spring. May have once belonged to others, but the earth still remembered their touch. Revolution didn't reside within them the way it would in later generations, not in rousing speeches or painted banners carried by crowds. But there was another kind of power found in how they carried on. To endure a life filled with suffering without allowing that suffering to turn their hearts to stone. That was its own quiet form of rebellion. To bow, not from defeat, but from knowing they'd stand again the next day. That too was a form of resistance. And so they continued, gently, silently, with no statues raised or ballads sung in their honour. Their strength echoed in the steady rhythm of the plough, in the smoke curling from cottage rooftops at twilight, in lullabies murmured beside fading embers. They lived on in the tales told to children who would someday share those same stories. History has often overlooked them, or tucked their names beneath footnotes written under crowns and conquest. Yet it was the peasants who stitched the fabric of society together. Without their labour, no harvests would have filled the granaries, no cathedrals would have risen toward the heavens, no soldiers would have marched beneath proud banners. They shaped the world, though they were seldom allowed to claim a piece of it. They may not have risen against their lords with fire and fury, but they outlived them. And perhaps in the end that was a revolution all its own.